So this is the lecture on infant musical development. For the reading, you read chapter 8 in the Psychology of Music textbook, and then you also read the study by Rabinowitz and Cross. And so we'll talk a little bit about how infants, research on infant musical development. So why do we study infants? Well, obviously they're cute, but they also can tell us a lot about development, or how we we grow musically as soon as we're born. It can reveal how and what we all learn as we develop. Do we come in completely a blank slate and we have to have certain experiences in order to perceive or understand music, or are there neural networks that are already at play as soon as we're born? Um, Studying infants also can reveal what kinds of knowledge needs special training and exposure. It can also reveal predispositions for processing species-specific traits. And lastly, it can help us reveal universals. It can, if we can see that these beings that have had very little experience, have had virtually no exposure to our culture, because that's the thing is, we're always I don't know if we've talked about this in this class, but the nature versus nurture argument or debate is kind of over, because it's really hard um, to separate the two, because you might have gotten something genetically from your parents, but at the same time your parents raised you in most cases, and not all cases, but that's how it is. And um, so looking at infants who've had very little exposure to any kind of influence other than purely genetics, um, it could help reveal universals, or things that are true about how our brain and our cognition works. So we're first going to start talking a little bit about prenatal studies. And I thought this was really interesting in the reading about how even before an infant is born, that they have hearing capabilities during the last 3 months that they are in utero. Um, and I think the book does a pretty good job of kind of explaining what we feel, what researchers believe that oral experience is for fetuses. Is that it's not like they're just hanging out and they can hear everything that is going on in the room, but that they have kind of a different, more muffled exposure, and they don't hear high amplitude, or sorry, high frequency tones as well as they hear low frequency tones, and that the internal sounds of the mother are also competing, for what the baby can hear. But we do know that newborns respond differently neurologically to words and music heard prior to birth. So when after they're born, they do respond to sounds that they heard before they were born. It's kind of crazy stuff, but that's where it looks like researchers have found about that. So how do we study infants? So we do all this research on infants that are very young. They can't communicate with us. They can't explain what is going on, or why they're making the choices that they make. There are a couple of different ways that researchers have gone about to study infants, and one of them is called HAS, high amplitude sucking. And in the book, it kind of describes this, where babies will suck longer when they're experiencing a stimulus that they enjoy. And so the longer that they are engaged with this device, the more that they are interested in whatever stimulus is being presented to them. So that's the first. Another thing that we do to study infants is we use heart rate habituation, which kind of looking at heart rates, and it's a little bit counterintuitive because when the heart rate decreases, it tends to be a signal that that the infants are more interested or more focused on the stimulus than if their heart rate. And so, like I said, that's counterintuitive. And I think it's because we think that heart rates increase when there's higher arousal. But I think for babies this young, it's more about them focusing their energy on something, and that kind of makes a little bit of sense that you know their automatic systems would kind of slow down a bit because they're trying to put all their resources to this one thing, as opposed it's not that they're being aroused by something, it's that they're trying to focus on it. So another way that we study infants is called this process of visual reinforcement audiometry, and this is a process where the researchers essentially train the baby to look at a certain place. And so like they kind of pair a sound with looking to a certain place and giving them sort of visual reward, like seeing a toy kind of move and light up. And so they train the baby that when they hear the sound that they look over there, and then they're rewarded by this visual stimulus. So how they do this is to see if they recognize, various sounds. They'll have an observer, and the observer doesn't know whether the sound has been presented or not. And then the observer will mark whether they looked at, on each trial, whether the infant looked at the stimulus or not. They also use other preference-looking behaviors where they'll present different, like maybe two different stimuli. I don't remember if it was in this chapter where they talk about consonant and dissonant sounds, and so how they did it was essentially the same thing, where they present like a toy that's lit up with one sound and consonant, and then so like consonant sounds would be over here, dissonant sounds would be over here. So like on this trial, they do consonant sounds, and they watch how long they look at that one, and they time it, and then they do dissonant sounds, and they watch how long they look at that toy. So that's so they use these preference looking behaviors, and more recently, they've been using EEG and MEG as well. MEG, magnetoencephalography, and EEG, electroencephalogram. So those are actual, neural data that we're getting from babies. And, there was a picture, I think, it's a very, very cute picture of a really happy baby. Yep, on page 144. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about what has been discovered about melodic perception, rhythm perception, memory, and auto-infant interactions that has all been studied through the use of infants. So with melodic perception, they found that babies are very good at, infants are very good at, if they teach them a pattern, then if they transpose the pattern, they have no problem with it. And this is the thing, a lot of this is, looking at either looking preferences or looking at brain scans where, there's an ERP, a reaction potential, because of something that's changed. And so for young infants, if they transpose a pattern, there's really the baby doesn't notice any difference. And when the contour is preserved, even if the intervals aren't the same, again, the baby doesn't really notice a difference. But if you violate the contour, then the baby will have a reaction. And so this has led, the researchers to think that, young infants, they really don't hear discrete pitches. They hear these patterns as kind of a holistic thing, and they just haven't gotten to the point where they can discretely hear different pitches and know that the discrete pitches might be different. So they really look at patterns and context, and this is kind of where it may be during this time period of I don't know. I was going to talk a little bit about that. Relative pitch is is not really hearing any difference in when you transpose these patterns, but it could be that infants with absolute pitch, at this point they're still or that they do notice differences, but I don't think there's any research to suggest that. So I don't know why I brought it up, so I apologize. With rhythmic perception, infants have sorry, looking at my notes. Infants are good at, in a similar way, that they can they can perceive rhythms even if they're changed, as long they can notice that they're similar if they as long as the proportion stays the same. So even if you speed it up or slow it down, so if you've got and you train them to hear that pattern over and over and over again, but later you present, even though it's a different tempo, they would not it would not create a reaction where they would think that something is different, which is really kind of weird. And again, it's the thinking behind it is that they hear the sounds kind of in relation to each other, as opposed to hearing the specific onsets each on their own. It's kind of wild. The other thing that was really interesting, and they talked about this a bit, was looking at Laurel Trainer's work with the bouncing, and they found that when they bounce children, they would present some sort of musical stimulus that was unclear if it was in duple or in triple meter. So there was no stress. And the researcher would bounce the baby either on duple, every other beat, or triple, once every 3 beats. And then they would play the same melody again to them, but they would play either the, accenting the duple or accenting the triple, or accenting triple meter. And the infants would be more interested in whatever they had bounced to, which is an interesting. It's interesting that it's and it was. I mean, the thing that is most interesting is that it only worked when they were bounced. If they were just listening and watching someone bouncing, then they had no preference over the duple or triple. But it was when they felt the beat in their body that they had more of affinity of one of the types of meters. So it's just really crazy that that this that the internalization of the beat, and that seems to play a really influential part in how the infant understands what they're hearing. So Laurel Trainer did another study since this book has been published on empathy, and I may have mentioned this in another lecture. I've mentioned this at some point this year, and I don't know what class it was in. But so it was essentially the same thing where they bounced the baby, an infant. I think it was slightly older. It was probably closer to like 8, 9 months old. They bounced the infant, and they would then do this thing where the researcher, they would put the baby down on the floor, and then the infant down on the floor, and then the researcher would drop their pen and be like, "Oh no, I've dropped my pen," and she would, kind of make a hand sign like this, like she's trying to get the pen. And so they were trying to see if the infants would try to help the researcher out by getting the pen and giving it to them, or if they would just go about do their own thing or get the pen for themselves or whatever. And what they found, very interestingly enough, is that those that were bounced with the researcher were much more likely to help the researcher. So again, it kind of builds this idea that in trained musical interaction between people at a very early age leads to pro-social behaviors, where collaborative behaviors. So it's very interesting for sure. Let's see here. Okay. Yeah. We're not going to talk about that, and that's okay. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about memory, and so when looking at infants, some of the studies that have looked at musical memory, they find that infants demonstrate recognition for songs that they hear repeatedly, and memory may be influenced by tonality, regularity of rhythm, and harmonic consonance. And so it's interesting because in the text it was talking about how they would have parents play 10 minutes of music over and over and over for their kid over a month period, and then take 2 weeks off and then come in and be tested, and they would play a similar piece, and they would be more interested in that than a piece that they had heard all in that time, because they were saying that it didn't stimulate them as much because they already knew what it was. And so again, it kind of shows that they're not hearing all the discrete elements of it. They're still just kind of responding to kind of the big picture aspects of it, how loud it is, and the regularity of the rhythm, and whether it's consonant or dissonant. But yeah, it's really interesting that we are able to tell that babies, that there's the fact that they have a distinction over how long they listen to these different pieces, some that were played for them, on a loop, and some that weren't, shows that they are retaining it. So it's very, very interesting. So what can infants do musically? So we have to remember that the priority of relative pitch and contour over interval information. So they really aren't, they're really not hearing it the same way we hear it. Like, that's still going to take some time and for them to develop. It's just like, when they're not hearing the words the exact same way that we say them. They have to take time to be able to hear the different phonemes and to be able to put those together to hear words. Similarly to pitch, there's a priority on temporal patterning over specific timing cues. So it's more about the relationship of the onsets to each other as opposed to when each onset happens. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit now about adult-infant interactions, and this is where, in the text it talks about infant-directed speech and infant-directed singing. So one of the things that, again, I just think is so intriguing. So these studies that looked at infant-directed singing, where a parent would actually be singing to a child, or they would ask someone to do that to a doll, that both infants and adults could discriminate which of those were infant-directed and which were just singing alone to a doll. That's crazy to me. Like, to me, that makes me excited. It makes me feel like that's part of that magical spark of what music is. That music really is this connection between two social beings. Um, so another thing that's very interesting about infant-directed singing is that people tend to have kind of signature songs, and that when they sing them over and over and over to their child, it's identical pitch. They stay in the same key, and they sing it about the same tempo. So it's really really interesting that we have this consistency, especially amongst people that don't consider themselves musicians. They still do this. In the text, it talked a little bit about lullabies versus play songs, and the infant response when you sing to a lullaby is that they would be more inward focused, because they're inward focused, and then the infant response to a play song was more outward focused, kind of seeing what is in the environment around them. All right, yeah. So the last little part that we're going to talk about is the study that we read about, which didn't deal with infants, but I think it's really interesting. It kind of ties into what I was talking about before about the empathy piece. Hold on, I'm trying to find it. So the study was really looking at, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in the next lecture, but there's this whole body of research that really tries to make the case that that music makes you smarter, right? Like, as music educators, we kind of have heard that shtick a long time, and especially in the 90s, maybe even to like a couple, like just after 2000, there were people that were saying, yes, music makes you smarter. Here's all these ways that it does that. And then, for the past 15 years or so, we've been actively debunking that and saying, well, it's not necessarily music makes you smarter. It's that smarter people take music, or there's a selection bias when you do these studies. So more studies in the past 15 years have kind of shown that there really aren't any verbal or mathematical gains that happen when you study music. That's just not, it's not as straightforward as we thought it was maybe 20 years ago. So the question has become, well, what does music do for us? We should just advocate that it makes people, gives people an opportunity to express themselves and people to have emotions and that sort of thing. But of course, that's not good enough. But anyway, but I think anthropologically, it's like the question is, well, what benefit are we getting in our society or in our culture or in the development of our species if it's not doing something that would make us more more likely to survive? And so that's kind of the whole idea of evolutionary biology. So these researchers, Rabinowitz and Cross, they really were saying, well, maybe music provides it really helps support pro-social behaviors, and it helps construct empathy, because it's through empathy that people have to work together, and in order to live together. And so they wanted to see if this hypothesis that empathy could be a byproduct of music interaction, which is really interesting when they're building their argument in the study. They talk about kind of these different things about music that is collaborative, and it's really quite poetic. Some of the things that they talk about, this idea of gosh, I can't think of it now. Floating intention, I think, is maybe what they're saying, because what they're saying is that music has this ability to communicate to everyone, but the actual message is not discrete, right? It's there. There's this, and again, I think this is Cross's wording, is that there's this floating intention on how that people get the gist, but it's also meaningful for them in their own specific way too. So anyway, in the study, they really want to explore the relationship between musical group interaction and the development of emotional empathy. And so how they did this, they had 52 children, and they randomly assigned them to either the music experimental group, those that I feel like there are more children than this in this notes, because there were actually 3 groups. There was the music group, then there was a control group that played games, and then there was another control group that did nothing at all. So, they were either put in the music group or the game group or nothing at all. And they did a pre and a post quasi-experimental design over a full year. So they assessed them pre-experiment and then after the entire year. And then the music group interaction program was a series of musical games designed to promote self-other interactions like entrainment, imitation, flexibility. I thought that was really interesting part of the study when they were kind of describing some of the activities. I was like, oh, these would be great things for middle school students to do, just, have improvisation games, things like that. So, okay. So the kids were either in the music group, the game group, or they weren't in a group at all. And then at the end of all this, they were given 3 different tasks. They were either, the first measure was where they were supposed to match faces. Some of this is confusing because there are a lot of faces that are involved in these measures. So they would watch a video and they would select the facial expression that expresses how they felt during the video, or how they felt for a character in the video, I think. So that was the first one. The second one was an index of empathy, where they actually responded to questions like, it makes me sad to see a girl who can't find anyone to play with. That kind of thing. And the third one was where it was similar to the matched faces, except that the children were asked to identify which face they were shown prior to the clip. So this was more implicit measure of empathy, because, and this is where in the study I wasn't entirely clear on, but because it made it sound like they didn't necessarily show them the actual face. It might have been a similar face, but then they were given a forced choice of, did you see this face or this face before the clip, and or a while ago. And the idea is that one of those faces was more like what the face was in the clip, and so if they had a connection with what the person was doing in the clip, if they had an actual feeling of empathy for that character, then they would identify that face. So there were those 3 different measures. And then when they did their results, they found no difference between the matched faces. And but they did find significant differences between on the other two measures. So on the index of empathy, the group that was group that they reported having more empathy for others, which again, it could be that, even though these were music activities, it could be that there was a lot of, make sure you have a partner that's, that no one's left out. So it could have, even though the musical activity could have been what did it, it could have been the way that the activities were framed. That's something that we need to tease out in future research. But then the pretty significant finding was that the memory task, where they were asked to see the face, those that were in the music group were much more likely to identify the feeling of, identify the face that matched the empathy or the emotion that was being evoked by the character in the clip. And so the authors kind of suggest that, these students these kids that were in this music experiment, or the experimental group, that they become more adept at visual cues of emotions from others. And I mean, that's very interesting. This is all pretty new research in the past couple of years. So a lot more research needs to be done to really support these findings, but it's very exciting. And for me, it makes a little bit of sense of why every culture that's ever been studied has some sort of musical component to its culture. So it's something very interesting to think about. We're going to talk in the next chapter. We're going to actually, before I talk about the next chapter, this is the end of the next. So next week after this will be the second midterm, and then the following week we'll do another chapter on it's still development, but I think I call it music learning, and it's kind of more about how musical skills are gained, and that'll be the following week. So next week after this will be the second midterm, which most of you did really pretty well on the first midterm. Remember, you have multiple opportunities to take it, but you won't get any feedback. You just get your score. You don't get feedback on what questions you got right and which ones you got wrong. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to send them my way. Hopefully, you're on spring break right now. I'm recording this during your spring break. Hopefully in the next day or two, all of the assignments you've turned in will have been graded, and you'll have an idea of what your grade is in the class very soon. All right, thanks. I'll talk to you later.